I'm Isabel, I'm 40, and at 30 I discovered my inheritance didn't exist. My grandmother had left me a house worth $2 million, antique jewels, and an art collection. But when she died, my uncle, the executor, organized a surprise wedding at the funeral. Yes, a wedding, at my grandmother's funeral. My cousin Alina, the favorite, married a man no one knew, in a ceremony no one saw, with a certificate that appeared days later. And according to the new will that also appeared days later, the inheritance passed to Alina's husband, who turned out to be an employee of my uncle, hired for $5,000 to sign papers. All legal, all documented, all stolen. I spent 8 years investigating. I learned law. I learned forensic accounting. I learned to trace shell companies. And at 38, I married my uncle's son. The cousin who never spoke to me, who grew up with my inheritance, who became the face of the family business built with what was stolen from me. Not for love, for strategy. Because in this state, spouses have the right to 50% of assets acquired during marriage. And because I documented every penny my uncle moved, every shell company, every transfer. My husband doesn't know. He thinks I'm the poor cousin who fell in love with his money. But on our honeymoon, in the hotel my grandmother built, in the suite that should be mine, I showed him the documents, and I told him, "Your father stole my inheritance. You grew up with it, and now, as your wife, I'm going to take half of everything you have left. Not because I hate you, because it's math. And your father, who understood numbers, should have taught you to add better." I grew up in a family where wealth was a performance. My grandmother, Doña Carmen, was the last of a line of landowners who had survived revolutions, wars, and economic collapses by becoming something else: collectors, patrons, hosts of the cultural events that defined our city's elite. She owned a house that was a museum, a history preserved in stone and wood, and the careful placement of objects that each told a story of survival, of adaptation, of the transformation of violence into beauty. I was her favorite, not because I was special, but because I was present. My parents lived in the same city, in a smaller house, in a life that was defined by my father's illness, real or imagined, never fully diagnosed, always sufficient to justify dependence, to explain absence, to create the space where my uncle Fernando could operate. I spent summers with Doña Carmen, learning to arrange flowers, to catalog books, to recognize the provenance of paintings that had been acquired through means that were never discussed but always understood. She promised me the house. Not explicitly, not in writing, but in the way that grandmothers promise, through stories, through the showing of secret spaces, through the introduction to the caretakers and the lawyers and the network of people who maintained the property. "This will be yours," she would say, touching a doorframe, a window, a particular view. "You understand it, you love it, you will care for it when I'm gone." I was 22 when she died. A stroke, quick, unexpected, the kind of death that leaves everything unfinished, that creates the space for manipulation, that allows the executor to become the author of the narrative. Fernando, my uncle, her eldest son, the one who had managed her affairs for years, who had access to her lawyers, her notaries, her network of influence. The funeral was elaborate. Doña Carmen would have approved, would have expected, would have demanded the performance of grief that matched her status. I was in the front row, between my parents, my father frail and trembling, my mother efficient and composed, both of them dependent on Fernando for the logistics that they could not manage themselves. And then the surprise. Fernando stood, after the eulogy, after the tears, after the performance of mourning that had satisfied the audience. He announced that Alina, his daughter, my cousin, had been secretly engaged, that the engagement had been Doña Carmen's last wish, that the wedding would take place now, in this moment, as a tribute to the grandmother who had always loved celebrations. A man appeared. I didn't know him. No one knew him. He was introduced as Marco, an Italian, a businessman, someone Alina had met on her travels. He spoke no Spanish or pretended not to, communicated through Fernando, signed documents that were presented to him, stood beside Alina in a ceremony that lasted 5 minutes, that involved no vows I could understand, that produced a certificate that was immediately notarized by a man who was present, who had been waiting, who was known to be Fernando's golf partner. I was confused. I was grieving. I was 22, inexperienced, trusting, raised in a family where wealth was complicated and legal processes were mysterious, and the adults managed everything for the benefit of all. I accepted the explanation that was offered, that Doña Carmen had wanted this, that the marriage was part of her final wishes, that the documents would be sorted out in the coming days. The will appeared 3 days later. Or rather, the updated will, the one that superseded any previous versions, the one that had been notarized by the same man who had witnessed the wedding, the one that left the house to Alina's husband, the jewels to Alina, the art collection to a foundation that Fernando controlled. Nothing to me. Nothing to my father. Nothing to the promises that had been made in conversations in summers in the secret spaces of the house that was now someone else's. I asked questions. Fernando deflected. Tax complications, he said. The marriage changed the structure. Your grandmother's wishes were complex. Trust me, Isabel, I'm handling everything. I trusted him. For 2 years I trusted him. For 3, 4, 5. I accepted the delays, the complications, the processes that take time. I finished my law degree, started working in a small firm, lived in an apartment I could barely afford, watched Alina move to Paris, to a life funded by my inheritance, to a career as a patron of the arts that was built on my grandmother's collection. At 28, I found the receipt. A jewelry auction, private, in Geneva. The tiara that Doña Carmen had shown me, that she had worn in portraits, that she had promised would be yours to wear on your wedding day. Sold by Fernando through an intermediary to a collector whose name was not disclosed. The price was not listed, but the estimate was in the hundreds of thousands. I began to understand. Not all at once, not completely, but gradually, the way you understand a disease from symptoms, from the accumulation of evidence, from the recognition that the explanation you've been given does not match the reality you observe. I investigated. Not as confrontation, but as education. I learned forensic accounting, the tracing of money through shell companies, the identification of beneficial owners, the legal structures that allow theft to appear as business. I worked in firms that specialized in this, that represented clients who had been robbed by their own families, that taught me the techniques I would use against my own. I found the wedding certificate. Marco, the Italian, was not Italian. He was a waiter at a restaurant Fernando owned, hired for $5,000, flown to the funeral, flown back to his country the next day, never knowing what he had signed, never seeing Alina again, never receiving anything beyond the payment that had purchased his participation in a fraud. I found the shell company. Panamanian, anonymous, controlled by Fernando through layers of nominees. The recipient of the house's title, the jewels' sale proceeds, the art collections transfer, the company that owned properties in Paris, in London, in Miami, that funded Alina's lifestyle, that appeared in no public records connected to Fernando but was connected through the documentation I accumulated. I found the notary, the golf partner, the witness to the wedding, the notarizer of the will, the facilitator of the fraud. He had done this before, I discovered. Other families, other funerals, other surprise weddings that transferred wealth from the deserving to the designated. He was a specialist, a professional, a man who had turned the manipulation of grief into a career. At 30, I had the proof. Documents, transfers, contracts, photographs of Marco working in a restaurant, the wedding certificate with his signature, the shell company records, the property transfers. I took them to a lawyer, a specialist in estate fraud, who reviewed them and told me what I already knew. The case was strong, but the statute of limitations was approaching, and the legal system was slow, and Fernando had connections, and the cost would be enormous and the outcome uncertain. I didn't file. Not because I accepted defeat, but because I recognized that legal process was not the only process, that justice could be achieved through other means, that the system that had enabled the theft could also enable the recovery. I spent 8 years preparing. I worked in firms that handled complex estates, that managed family wealth, that understood the structures Fernando had used. I became an expert in the very techniques that had been used against me, the legal instruments that allowed transfer without taxation, the corporate forms that concealed ownership, the trust structures that protected assets from claims. And I studied Alejandro, Fernando's son, my cousin, the boy who had grown up in my house, who had played in my gardens, who had become the face of the family business that was built on my stolen inheritance. He was 38, unmarried, successful in the way that children of thieves are successful, managing companies he didn't understand, living in wealth he didn't earn, believing in his father's narrative of business acumen and strategic investment. I met him at a conference, not accidentally. I arranged my attendance, my presentation, my seating at the dinner where he would be present. I made myself interesting, available, attracted. I performed the role of the poor cousin who had made good, who had overcome, who had become sophisticated and desirable despite her modest origins. He was not difficult to attract. He was vain, in the way of men who have always had what they wanted, who have never been denied, who believe their charm is inherent rather than purchased. He was also lonely, in a way he didn't recognize, surrounded by people who wanted his money, who performed affection for access, who had never taught him to distinguish between genuine connection and strategic interest. I performed genuine connection. I listened to his stories, his complaints, his dreams. I shared my own, carefully constructed, designed to create resonance, to suggest compatibility, to build the foundation for something he would believe was love. We dated for a year. I managed the pace, the intensity, the progression. I was patient, in the way that predators are patient, that hunters are patient, that I had learned to be patient through 8 years of preparation. I let him believe he was pursuing me, that he was winning me, that his persistence was overcoming my resistance. He proposed. I accepted. Not with joy but with the performance of joy, the tears that were practiced, the embrace that was calculated, the narrative that would be convincing to him, to his father, to the world that would observe our union. The wedding was small, intimate, romantic. I insisted on this, explaining that I didn't need grandeur, that I valued privacy, that our love was sufficient without the performance that others required. Fernando was suspicious. He had always been suspicious of me, of my questions, of the years I had spent in law and finance, of the expertise that could challenge his control. But he could not deny his son, could not object without explanation, could not prevent the marriage without revealing his fear. I drafted the prenuptial agreement, ostensibly protective of Alejandro, of his assets, of the family wealth that Fernando had built. I included clauses that appeared standard, that referenced standard forms, that incorporated language that was familiar to Fernando's lawyers. But I included other clauses, carefully hidden, that gave me rights to assets acquired during the marriage. That defined acquired broadly, that included inheritances received by the spouse, that created the legal foundation for what I would claim. Fernando's lawyers reviewed it. They found nothing. They were competent, but not as competent as I was. They were careful, but not as careful as I had become. They approved the document, and we signed, and the marriage was legal, and the foundation was laid. The honeymoon was in the house. Doña Carmen's house, now a luxury hotel, owned by the Panamanian Shell Company, managed by a subsidiary, generating revenue that flowed to Fernando's network. I booked the suite, the master bedroom, the space that had been promised to me, that had been shown to me, that had been taken from me through the fraud of the funeral wedding. Alejandro didn't know. He believed the hotel was his father's investment, a successful business, a symbol of the family's continued prosperity. He didn't know that the prosperity was mine, that the investment was theft, that the history of the property was written in my blood and my loss and my 8 years of preparation. I waited until the second night. We had dined, we had walked through the gardens that I knew better than he did. I had pointed out the flowers that my grandmother had planted, the trees that I had climbed, the views that had been promised to me. He was happy, content, believing that he was sharing his world with me, that I was becoming part of his history. I showed him the documents, not all of them but enough. The wedding certificate with Marco's signature, the photograph of Marco in the restaurant, the Shell Company records, the property transfers, the tiara auction receipt. I explained in the calm voice of a lawyer presenting a case, the fraud that had been committed, the theft that had been disguised, the inheritance that had been stolen. And I explained his role, not as thief but as beneficiary. The child who had grown up in my house, who had played in my gardens, who had been given what was mine without knowing its origin. He was not guilty, but he was responsible. Not for the theft, but for the possession. Your father stole my inheritance, I said. You grew up with it, and now, as your wife, I'm going to take half of everything you have left, not because I hate you, because it's math, and your father, who understood numbers, should have taught you to add better. Alejandro didn't believe me, not initially. He defended his father, as children defend, as beneficiaries defend, as those who have never been denied defend against the possibility that their world is built on theft. He called Fernando, demanded explanations, received the deflections and denials that I had anticipated. But I had prepared for this. I had additional documents, more detailed, more damning. I had the records of other frauds, other families, other surprise weddings at funerals. I had the notary's history, the pattern of manipulation, the evidence that Fernando was not a businessman but a thief, not a patriarch but a predator. Alejandro confronted Fernando. Not at my request, but at his own, driven by the betrayal that he was only beginning to comprehend. He discovered more than I had shown him. He discovered that his own inheritance was compromised, that Fernando had been stealing from everyone, including his own son, that the wealth Alejandro believed was his was encumbered, leveraged, at risk of collapse. He became a witness, not for me but against his father. He provided testimony, documents, access to records that I could not have obtained. He became, in effect, my ally not out of love for me, but out of betrayal by the father he had trusted. Fernando was convicted, not for the theft of my inheritance, the statute of limitations, the legal complexities. The challenges of proving fraud committed 18 years earlier made that case difficult. But for tax fraud, for evasion, for money laundering, for the crimes that I had documented during my 8 years of investigation, the financial manipulations that were ongoing, that were provable, that could not be denied. The shell company was dissolved. The properties were seized. The hotel, my grandmother's house, was returned to a structure that I could access, that I could claim, that I could transform. I received, as Alejandro's wife, the 50% that the prenuptial agreement had guaranteed. Not because I wanted it, but because it was mine, because it had always been mine, because the law that had enabled the theft could also enable the recovery. But I didn't keep it. I donated it, the half that was mine, to a foundation for victims of estate fraud. I created a center, named Carmen, not for vengeance but for prevention, for education, for the protection of others who might be robbed by their own families, who might find themselves at funerals where weddings were staged, who might discover that their inheritances had been stolen by those they trusted. Alejandro and I didn't divorce immediately. We had a debt to each other, a connection that was not love but was something more honest than the performance we had both maintained. He had grown up with my stolen wealth. I had used him to recover it. We were both damaged by the same man in different ways, and that damage became the foundation for an alliance that was not marriage but was not entirely false. We lived together for a time in the house. Not as husband and wife, but as survivors, as witnesses, as two people who understood what it meant to have been used by a system that was supposed to protect. We restored the house, not to its previous state, but to something new, something that honored my grandmother's memory without replicating her mistakes, that acknowledged the beauty she had created without accepting the violence that had preserved it. Eventually, we separated. Not with acrimony, but with recognition that our connection was temporary, strategic, based on circumstances that no longer existed. He moved to another city, to build something of his own, to discover whether he could create wealth without theft, success without fraud, identity without inheritance. I remained, in the house, in the center, in the work that became my life. I helped others who had been robbed, who had been manipulated, who had found themselves at funerals where weddings were staged, where wills were altered, where the legal system that should have protected them became the instrument of their destruction. The epilogue came years later. A young woman, 25, appeared at the center. She had been at her grandmother's funeral, where her cousin had married a stranger, where a will had appeared, where her inheritance had disappeared. She had found us through the internet, through the stories that had been published, through the network of survivors that we had built. She sat in my office, in the house that had been stolen and recovered, and she told me her story. The details were different, but the structure was identical. The surprise wedding, the unknown groom, the notary who was a golf partner, the shell company, disappearance of wealth that had been promised. I listened. I showed her the documents from my own case, the patterns, the techniques, the legal structures that enabled the fraud. I explained the process of investigation, of documentation, of the patience required to build a case that could succeed. And I told her about Alejandro. Not as a model, but as a possibility. The possibility that the children of thieves could become allies, that the beneficiaries of fraud could become witnesses, that the system that had enabled theft could also enable justice. She asked, at the end, whether I regretted marrying him. Whether the strategic marriage, the calculated performance, the use of another person for recovery had cost me something that I could not recover. I thought about the question. I thought about the years of preparation, the performance of love, the honeymoon in the house that should have been mine, the moment when I showed the documents and changed everything. I don't regret it, I said. Not because it was right, but because it was necessary. Not because it was moral, but because it was the only path that led to justice. I used him as his father used me, but I used him to stop the cycle, to prevent further theft, to protect others. And in the end, he chose to help me. He chose to become something other than his father's son. That choice, that possibility, is what I don't regret. If someone stole your inheritance, if they made it legal, if they documented it and notarized it and performed the fraud in front of witnesses who didn't understand what they were seeing, hear me. The system that enables theft can also enable recovery. The law that protects thieves can also protect you. And the patience required to build a case, to learn the techniques, to understand the structures that were used against you, that patience is not weakness. It is the foundation of justice. That's my story. If it spoke to you, comment below. If someone stole what was yours and called it legal, tell me. I'll read every word. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.